Welcome to the next video. In this video, we're going to talk about Taking the Nation's Pulse, Chapter 7. We're talking here in this chapter about GDP and how measuring GDP measures the health and vivacious energy of an economy. What does GDP stand for? Well, GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Gross domestic product is all finished goods and services produced in a country or in an economy in a specific time period. So it's the total value of all market products in a certain time. It could be a year, it could be a month, it could be a quarter. And we can compare that to previous quarters and be able to predict the trajectory of the growth of an economy based on past history. Now, GDP is compared to itself in using current dollars or current currency. In economy, if we're talking about US, we're talking about dollars. If we're talking about India, we're talking about rupee. If we're talking about the UK, we're talking about the British pound sterling. Each country, and we compare each country to itself. That's called using what's called nominal GDP, or today's dollars. When you listen to the news and you hear the news reporter talking about GDP, they're really referring to nominal GDP in today's dollars. But when you talk about GDP from 2008 or 1976, what was the GDP in 76 compared to today? You can't do that. That's like comparing apples to oranges. What we really need to say is the difference between the 1976 dollar and the 2018 or the 2020 dollar is different because of inflation. And we'll get into inflation a little bit more in another video. But to summarize quickly, inflation is the change in prices over time as they go up and sometimes go down. In 2009, we had deflation or negative inflation where prices were falling, for instance. And that has happened in the history. Other times, most of the time, prices go up. And when we consider that the prices of products are going up, the finished goods from 1976, 1988, 2008, 2020, are all different values. And so we have to compare or reduce or adjust for inflation these prices. And that's called real GDP. So we're taking the real value. The difference between nominal and real is really nominal is in today's dollars, and real is a comparison of product to product. So it's related to and turned into or translated into a dollar value, but it's really the real value is what you can do with that dollar. And so, for instance, so what is the difference between real and nominal? This is a dollar. We all agree that this is a dollar. So, would you say that Abraham Lincoln, when he was president, had a dollar? Probably. Not the very one I have. The very one that I showed you was actually printed in 2013. So no, I doubt he had that dollar, this particular dollar, but he had a dollar bill in his pocket at some time or another in his presidency. Would you also say that President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, had a dollar in his pocket when he was president? Probably. How about Richard Nixon? Did he have a $1 in his pocket when he was president? Surely. How about President Obama? Did he have a dollar in his pocket? Sure, I'm sure he had a dollar sometime in his administration, that he had a dollar in his pocket sometime. Now, this particular dollar that, the particular dollar that Abraham Lincoln had was a week's wages, meaning that a family could live off of $1 a week. When John F. Kennedy was president, and that particular dollar was able to buy 4 gallons of gas, because the price was about 25 cents a gallon at that time. By the time Nixon was in office, it went up to 3 gallons of gas, about 33 cents or 33 cents a gallon was when the price went up to. So that same dollar was only able to buy 3 gallons versus 4. By the time President Obama was in office, the price of gas had gone up so high that $1 could buy a quart of gas, approximately, because the price of gas had risen to about $4 in some places in the country at one point, when the price of, in 2008. Now, between Kennedy and Obama, we have 40 plus years, over 40 years of time between the two presidents. And in that 40 years, it went from 4 gallons of gas to a quarter of gas, a quarter of a gallon or a quart of gas. So you see that the value of the dollar has changed between that, even those 40 years. So we can't say or look at the 60s and look at the GDP in the 60s and compare it to the GDP in 2008 and say there's growth or not, because their dollars are different. So we have to look at the products. How many gallons of gas, how many apples, how many gallons of milk, how many cars were produced in the 60s? How many apples and gallons of milk and cars were produced in 2008? That's the real value of GDP. Now, GDP is and this is the formula you want to take in consideration. Alphabet soup. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. C plus I plus G plus NX. C stands for consumer spending. Consumer spending. That is you and me going out to the store and buying stuff. You and me going to the dealership and buying a car. You and me going to buy a movie ticket. You and me going to H&R Block to have our taxes done. You and me talking to an accountant. You and me going to get some business advice. You and me going to the bank and getting borrowing money. All those activities, whether it's a service or a product, is part of our consumer spending. And consumer spending is about 70% of GDP. We are a large proportion of GDP. I stands for business investment or investment spending, not investment when you go and buy a stock or a bond, not that type of investment. When we're talking about investment here, we're talking about the investment that businesses do in themselves and buying machines, buying factories, buying factors of production. Those, not factors, but buying machines for that. Investing in growth. And that business investment is about 12% of GDP. G stands for government spending. That's the government buying finished goods and services. It's the government buying coffee pots, computers, desks, those finished goods. That's the government buying it for a government office, businesses buying it for the business office, and since we've been spending a lot of time at home during this 2019 pandemic, we've been buying computers for our homes too, to work from home. Now, NX stands for net exports, and government spending is about 22% of GDP, about 22%. Net exports is really exports, all finished goods in an economy that we send out of the country, minus imports, the finished goods from other countries that we bring in. And that sub-function is what we call net exports, the net of what we export. Now, so far, if you look at the numbers that I just read off, 70, 12, and 22, we're already over 100%. So QED, the net exports must be negative. It's about 4. It's a negative 4%. Now, these numbers are not hard fact numbers. They change over time, increases and decreases here and there, and changes, and they are always in flux. So these numbers are just to give you an idea of the size of each of the 4 parts of GDP. Now, in a closed economy, we don't have net exports because we are not exporting anything. It's all internal, so we just have the C, the I, and the G. And the G part is what's called exogenous. Write that word down. Exogenous means that it's something that starts outside. And it's not, the government is outside of the system in that it's overarching, in that it helps decide what the government, how the economy flows. As I said in my 10 tenets, the economy works best when the government helps grease the wheels and helps the economy, and certain outcomes work because the government is involved. Now, the other 2 parts, the consumer spending and business investments, are endogenous. AN versus EXEN, endogenous, meaning they're part of the system. And so those 2 parts right there actually help move and grow the economy most. And the most, the absolute most, is consumer spending. So consumer spending, and that goes back to what I mentioned about consumer sovereignty, is that the consumer is really important in how the economy flows, and that the circular flow of the economy. When we talk about an open economy, then we are now opening up to the international market, the rest of the world, and exporting and importing. This is also any finished good that's made in a system is also, when the money is flowing from the consumer out, where does it go? It goes to businesses. Remember the circular flow. So as the consumer is buying a product and consumer spending, then businesses are getting that money. So that's part of their income. And as the businesses are investing and producing and selling, that money that they get is coming back to us in that circular flow as part of the factors, because they're getting factors like labor to produce. So that's why they're interrelated and they're endogenous. Now, before I go any further, why mention that GDP is comprised of finished goods and services in a system? I specifically say that you need to be careful about that, produced in that same year. I didn't mention that before. I say it again, in that same year or that same time period. So there are several things that are not counted in GDP. So let's go through the list of what is not counted in GDP. 1, goods that are not produced in the same year or secondhand goods. For instance, if you went out and bought a 2000 car, a 2000 Nissan, or a 2000 Ford, let's go with Ford, and you buy a 2000 Ford today, that 2000 Ford was counted in 2000. So buying it today, even though it's a finished good, it's not considered counted in today's GDP because it was produced and was available for the consumer back in 2000. 2, intermediary goods. going back to Ford. Now, Ford uses Champion spark plugs. And Ford buys Champion spark plugs from Champion and puts it into the Ford Fusion. Let's make it the F-150. It puts it in the F-150, and then you drive it off the line, and you buy a 2020 Ford Fusion, Ford F-150 truck. And that is purchased in 2020. It's counted in 2020 GDP. But the spark plugs are not counted because they are counted with the F-150. So the Champion spark plugs in the F-150 is counted as part of and value added to the F-150. Without the spark plugs, the car won't run, the truck won't run. Now, conversely, if you went to O'Reilly's or AutoZone and went to the spark plug shelf and saw a packet of spark plugs and bought that Champion spark plugs from AutoZone or O'Reilly's or any other auto supply store, that is where it's counted as part of GDP based on it was being produced in 2020 and you buy it in 2020, then it's counted. Part of what we count in GDP is what the access to the consumer, to the end user. The end user does not access the spark plugs in the F-150 without the F-150. Going to O'Reilly's, you're accessing it as a consumer directly from O'Reilly's, and that's where it's counted in GDP. 3, financial transactions are not counted. So if you go to your Aunt Bertha and borrow $500 from Aunt Bertha and you pay her back $500 in 2020, that is not counted because the cash that you got from Aunt Bertha and borrowing is just transferred between the two. So that's considered a transfer payment or a financial transaction. Buying stocks and bonds are not considered. Borrowing money from the bank is not counted, but the interest you pay would be counted. And the service that is provided by the teller and the loan officer is counted in GDP when you borrow for that borrowing. But the money is not counted. The loan amount is not counted in GDP. Another thing that's not counted is underground economy. Now, a drug dealer is selling a product, right? So it's not counted because it is illegal. So because it's an illegal transaction, buying and selling drugs is not counted. That's an underground economy and is not part of GDP. Another thing that's not counted is leisure. Gordon Ramsay is a famous chef. We all kind of know Gordon Ramsay in his Kitchen Nightmares or Hell's Kitchen or all those cooking shows that he does. He's a famous chef. He's a world-renowned famous chef. Almost everybody in the world knows Gordon Ramsay. So when Gordon Ramsay makes breakfast for his kids in the morning, does he actually, after they eat, hand them a bill saying, okay, you kids need to pay for the breakfast? No. He doesn't get paid for making breakfast at home because that is his outside of market transaction. Making food at home is not counted. But what is counted in GDP is Gordon Ramsay going to the store to buy the ingredients for his breakfast, but not the breakfast. Now, if you go to one of his restaurants and you eat breakfast at his restaurant, the restaurant breakfast is counted, but not the ingredients in the breakfast because it's when it is accessed by the consumer. When Gordon Ramsay goes to the store, he is a consumer. So let's calculate real GDP. Here are two products, hot dogs and hamburgers. And we have two different time periods. We have 2010 and 2018. And here are the prices for both at different time periods. Nominal GDP will take the number of hamburgers sold in that year times the price of hamburgers equals the total amount spent on hamburgers. And the number of hot dogs times the price of hot dogs equals the total amount spent on hot dogs. Add those together, and again, let's assume that there's the only two products in the entire economy. That would be the total amount for that year, and we do that again for the next year. So we have 2010 and 2018. That's the nominal GDP. Comparing the nominal GDP again is like comparing apples to oranges. So remember that song, that's what we're talking about. So how do we make them similar is the real GDP. What we do is we have to choose a base, and since we only have 2 years here, we're going to use 2010 as our base year. To calculate real GDP, and remember, real versus nominal is based on the quantity of products available and purchased, not price. And when we convert it into a dollar so we can compare dollars to dollars. So we take the price that we had for 2010 and multiply that by the quantity of 2015. We already have 2010 nominal GDP right here. So what we have to do is we have to convert 2015 into 2010 dollars. By doing that, now we have, what was it in 2010 dollars? What was it in 2010 dollars in 2018? Now we can look at the two and say, oh, well, we have one's greater than the other. And that tells us whether there was growth or there was a contraction between the 2 years. Was 2018 a growth year? Did we grow since 2010, or did we shrink since 2010? And this is an example. If we take the GDP from the later year, the real GDP from the later year, and divide that by the real GDP, which is also nominal, from the base year, and multiply that by 100, what we have is what's called a GDP deflator. And that is a percent, in a way. It's like a percent of the growth or contraction. If it's greater than 100, it's a growth. If it's less than 100, it's a contraction in the GDP. And that is how we can tell if there was any productivity or contraction. That's how we do it. And that's changing, that is adjusting for price and adjusting for inflation by reducing everything to the base year. Now we can reverse this. If we knew what the GDP deflator was, we can come up with real and nominal GDP. We can reverse these transactions, reverse the calculations, and work it backwards. Now, GDP deflator is different than CPI or inflation because it measures things a little differently. And I will get more into it when we talk about inflation as a comparison to GDP. But one thing that GDP or the GDP deflator is really measuring is also including, does not include the value of imported goods, because GDP, as recall from this formula, GDP takes out imported goods from the equation. Net exports, you see at the end here, net exports. So we're looking at the net of what we exported versus what we imported as a value of that international trade portion of GDP. So it shows the net of only our exported goods. So imports are not considered in the GDP calculation, but it does take in consideration the goods that are produced and purchased each year. So it does adjust in a way for consumer tastes. If we think about 2010, or let's look back to the late 60s. And if you think about consumer tastes, when we talked about in the 60s and 70s organic goods, that was the hippies that were growing on the communes. That was organic. Think about it, that. And then now people are striving for more organic because it's renewable. It's a renewable method of growing agriculture. We are now seeking more organic to facilitate that. But it started off with growing on communes by the hippies back in the 60s and 70s. And it was hippie food. So it was not considered mainstream. Now it is now mainstream. If we try to compare the GDP from the 60s, if we compare the prices of the 60s versus today, we're going to have a difference in GDP and using the deflator and CPI and using inflation. There will be two different measurements because of how inflation is measured.